There aren't a lot of experts on organ trafficking in the world. I can probably name 4 or 5 that are out there. I'm one of them.
What, if anything, is actually being done to tackle the red market?
We are doing absolutely nothing, Karan. I've been to probably 6 of these villages throughout South India where every single person in that refugee camp has sold their kidney. We basically are farming poor people for their organs, and that is dystopian.
How would someone in that sort of scenario who's so desperate to get an organ transplant or some sort of human tissue for themselves to prolong their life, practically, how can someone go about doing that? Scott, brilliant to have you with me today. And, we really could have spoken to you about a number of different topics because you're quite the prolific author. I mean, you recently released a book on sleep and dreams, human resilience. But I really want to delve in onto one subject you covered quite a while ago, and it's the red market. Now, what is the red market for people who aren't aware, and what inspired you to write a book about it?
So the red market is the commercial trade of human body parts, tissue, blood, hair, human eggs, all of the things that make you up and how they get moved through economic systems. And the reason why I wanted like a word for that wasn't just a market or like a white market or a black market was because when you start moving human body parts, pieces of me and pieces of you around, it's not just about money. It's about the ineffable value of human life itself, because someone has to sacrifice tissue in order to give it to another person. And so the considerations are profoundly important and raise ethical concerns that are well, not truly and simply resolvable.
What would you classify as something which would really make the ethical waters murky versus something like, for example, there are certain religious sites in India, one of the largest temples in South India, I think it's Tirupati, where a lot of the devotees go there and, they donate their hair. They shave their hair completely, and a lot of that hair gets packaged and then sold to wig manufacturers in the US. Now, I've actually been there, and I've shaved my head a couple of times when I've been with my parents. They're, Hindu, and I was aware that they, make some sort of profit on this, so it didn't irk me. But would you classify that as potentially ethically murky doing that, or is that different to something like, the financial exchanges someone could get from selling their plasma or blood?
So that was the least controversial subject that I covered in my book. I also went to Tirupati. I also had my hair shaven, and I saw the process of them not only collecting it into giant bags, but actually auctioning it off to hair resellers for a certain type of human hair processing called REMI processing, which means when you look at the hair follicle, it's got these like sort of like jagged edges that go in one direction. And if you are able to collect hair for a wig, it went in a single cut, the hairs don't get mixed up and it makes a better quality wig. And a lot of these wigs, they're really high end usually. I mean, we could be talking thousands of dollars for these sorts of wigs. So it has created quite a profitable trade for Tirupati. And honestly, I don't think it's bad. Like it's actually it's a good indication of what you do when you've collected a lot of human tissue and had a surplus. Because in that temple before the wig trade showed up, they were just using the human hair to stuff pillows and mattresses, and this was in the 50s and before then. And then they found this more profitable trade, and I don't think the people who give their hair at Tirupati have a problem with it. Although I will say, just as a side note, another place that the hair goes is to create a what do you call it? An amino acid or an enzyme called L-cysteine, which gets reduced and then ends up in your baked goods as a leavening agent. So sometimes when you eat sort of a processed bread, you might be eating human hair. And I lived in South India for 3 years, India in total. I lived there for 6. And, a lot of my research happens there. And the hair market, I'm happy to say, is the least ethically concerning of all.
Now, of this, red market and the sale of human tissue, what would you say is the entirety of the money being made by these bad actors using the red market?
So like the total value of like human tissue in illegal ways, or in like the total movement of human tissue through the systems. Because the reason I'm trying to clarify is because there's a lot of overlap. What might be, it might be legal to install a kidney in a location, and it might be even legal to purchase a kidney in a location. But when that person flies in from abroad, then now we have sort of these ethical murky waters. It might be legal to get a skin graft in the United States from a biological supply company, but that skin could have been harvested illegally from cadavers in funeral homes in my home state of Colorado, or in out of Eastern Europe. There was a huge skin graft black market that was broken up, where these were going to like registered and respectable looking biological supply companies. So it's really hard to truly tease it out. It's not like we have like mafiosos here with their own parallel hospital system, and then the good guys over here. It's all intermixed. And I would say, I don't remember what I estimated in 2011 when I wrote The Red Market. But it was at least billions of dollars at that point. And now we are, 12, 13 years later, and the demand for human tissue has only gone up because we haven't found a lot of synthetic tissues that replace it. Indeed, I think that the promise of synthetic tissues increases the demand for purchasing illegal organs and illegal things that are not ethically supplied well, because we believe we deserve these human materials. We believe that I have a kidney failure. I want a kidney. And in 10 years, we're going to have an artificial kidney. I want one now. This is just the way most people feel when they get that diagnosis of renal failure. Yeah, it's only getting worse. And I don't have a number. Like, how do you track this? Like, there's the bad guys don't register all the illegal kidney transactions. So there's no real way to know. But we know it's in billions. And possibly tens or high or low hundreds of billions of dollars worth of these materials.
Yeah, I guess, like you said, no one's going to declare this sort of red market transaction, so it's difficult to truly appreciate the value of this. And, just purely playing devil's advocate here, not that I condone any of this behavior, but if we look throughout history, some of medicine's greatest breakthroughs came from morally questionable ethics and dodgy dealings, and even in some cases illegally obtained bodies used for medical research. They've led to major medical discoveries in our understanding of the human body. For example, Andreas Vesalius, the Renaissance anatomist, often used illegally obtained bodies for making his thesis on the anatomy. So how do we separate the use of various medical bodies for research purposes? Like, for example, I know that it's not in humans, but in Europe, there are a lot of anatomical research centers that use live pigs, and they do courses on live pigs to teach budding surgeons anatomy and trauma scenarios, because you can't have a live human subject to a trauma scenario. But they have a sort of a anesthetized pig, and they cut out the spleen, they stab the pig and make it bleed and get someone to stop the hemorrhage. And that is, ethically very, very questionable in many countries, but it's allowed maybe in France, in Spain. So I guess in a similar scenario, but with humans, how do we say what is allowed and what's not in order to progress medicine and research?
Man, that is such a good question, because, the history of medicine, I mean, going back to Galen, okay, the first modern doctor, you could call him, we're talking in like Roman times, he would do live vivisections of pigs and show audiences of people that if you take a pig and you cut a nerve, that the leg would be paralyzed. And people are like, oh my God, you found out how nerves worked. And this is at the beginning of evidence-based medicine. You have these things that would seem very distasteful to a modern audience. And, ultimately this has to do with ethics in general. And if you actually look at how medicine operates, it demands a lot of tissue, a lot of monkeys, a lot of animals, a lot of risk taken to human participants in stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. That's the way we do it now. In the 20s and 30s and before, we would just test on people, and things could go wrong. Like there's the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where in the United States, we didn't infect a bunch of Black poor people, we had found a lot of people with syphilis, and we decided to treat some of them and not treat some other ones to see what the natural progression of the disease would be versus an intervention. Well, here's the problem with that. The science was actually pretty useful. I hate to say it, right? But we don't actually know the natural progression of a lot of diseases right now. Like, I don't know if you get, I don't know, a sarcoma or, breast cancer. We can't do placebo-controlled trials where one group gets no treatment. So we really know how bad it will go, all progressing all the way to death, and another treatment where it goes and it's positive. We have deemed that is not an ethical way to do things. So we do other types of tests that are more ethical and provide, the standard of treatment on one arm that exists currently versus a new investigatory treatment. And that it doesn't get us as good of data, but it gets us pretty good data. And you're not creating a lot of death and suffering along the way. Modern medicine is amazing. It is so fantastic. The amount of science, the amount of research, the way you control variables, and we've sort of found causal agents for things. We live in a miracle age, but we also have to accept that miracles have come at a tremendous cost of suffering. And that's not really the subject of the red market that I was investigating. I was looking at more like therapies that are proven. Like, we know you can get a kidney, right? We have proven this through lots of testing and actually doing it. Now the question is, where can we get enough supplies of kidneys to meet the current demand? And what is actually happening are people are having their kidneys stolen in large numbers. They're more often, though, they're bought from people who are in refugee camps, who are in very destitute situations. And then you have organ brokers coming in and saying, hey, you are dirt poor. I'll give you $500 for your kidney. And they're like, oh my God, $500, that's so great. And they get their $500. And then you have whole refugee camps. And you mentioned you lived in, or at least have been to South India. I lived in the South Indian city of Chennai, used to be called Madras. And there was a tsunami that killed 226,000 people, in 2004, 2005. And then all these people ended up in refugee camps. And Chennai happens to have really great hospitals, just like really good world-class hospitals there. And also there's a lot of diabetes in India, a tremendous amount of diabetes. So what happens is the rich people in India, Indians mostly, will find people to go to refugee camps, buy kidneys, and then they'll get them installed in themselves. And so we have a situation where this human flesh is moving up the social hierarchy.
Yeah.
It never moves the other way. I've never met a rich person. I've never seen Jeff Bezos be like, oh, I'm going to donate my kidney to someone like that. Yeah. There is no world where that happens. So we basically are farming poor people for their organs. And that is dystopian. It's terrible. And kidneys are obviously a very charismatic organ. It's something that we all sort of are aware of how they work. But these same supply chains work in many, many ways. And anytime you see a piece of human tissue, whether it's blood or bones or skin or even whole humans and surrogate labors and things like that, you have these economic supply chains that play out. And usually the same rules that apply to like producing Nike sneakers ultimately apply to human markets as well.
It's funny, the use of the phrase supply chain when it comes to the farming and distribution of human tissue. It's really, it's a juxtaposition there because when you think of supply chain, you think of supplement manufacturers, but actually, using that in this context seems so jarring, right? And on the subject of these kidney villages or these farms for kidney, I remember I came across a BBC article several years ago of this place called Kidney Village in Hoxay in Nepal. And it's funny because when I thought about that and when I looked deeper into these organ brokers going into these destitute villages where people are really suffering and very poor, and they're offered this lifeline essentially to change their fortunes, or so it seems on the surface, to be given X number of dollars for their kidney, and you can survive just fine with one kidney. But I guess that really disguises the problem at hand because they're having their kidneys removed in potentially unsanitary conditions, and they're just probably dumped somewhere. And that $500 or whatever they get probably doesn't go very far for their ongoing medical needs to recover after any such operation. So really, they might be in even a worse economic situation after they've been subject to selling any organ they might have sold.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, these aren't charitable organizations. These are
Mm,
hardcore capitalists looking for the cheapest available human flesh. This is not uplifting people. This is not, if I asked you, how much would you sell your kidney for? I don't know if you
mm.
have to, but you would come up with a price in your mind. I mean, you would probably
Yeah.
say no. First of all, you would probably say no. Second, if you did come up with a price, it would be an astronomical price. You'd be
Oh,
like,
yeah.
well, I'll give one up
100
for
million.
five. Oh man. Well, I was going to go for five, but maybe I have underestimated how valuable your kidneys are. But you're using a price that is so high that no one would actually pay for it. But when we get into the economics of the world, someone's destitution, someone's vulnerability is essentially being weaponized against them to feed a commercial system. And I've certainly seen people who've had less than good recovery because they live in very poor conditions. Oftentimes they're like dirt floor huts in refugee camps in India. And I don't know that particular village that you're talking about in Nepal, but I've been to probably 6 of these villages in throughout South India where every single person in that refugee camp has sold their kidney. And that's wrong. If there's something just morally wrong about the way that we have created these supply chains. And anyone who says this sort of libertarian ideology, well, someone should be free to do whatever they want to do, is really trying to obscure the fact that this isn't about freedom of your economic personhood. This is about the freedom of a rich person to buy a poor person's organ. And I think that we need to be more transparent about what we're really talking about here.
I guess there's this urban myth, right, that strikes fear into anyone's heart when they hear it. And it comes around this idea that you could be drugged at a party or a night out, or, you end up waking up in a bathtub with a kidney or organ removed and a huge scar and a bunch of stitches. But I guess this sort of dramatic scenario doesn't really play out in real life. I
Yeah, I
don't know,
don't think
you
it's
can
ever
maybe connect me.
happened.
But the truth is that it seems a lot of these people are forced to give consent through coercion and duress, right?
There are some instances of people being kidnapped for kidneys. I can probably think of 4 or 5 cases where this has happened. It's never the white rich party goer who ends up in
Yeah.
Tijuana and gets sucked into a honey trap. That's not the person, because honestly, if you're a criminal, you want to get as little attention onto your case as possible, right? You have every incentive to disguise the supply chain. So that's not what you do. If you're going to go steal someone's human tissue, you better find someone who no one cares about. And let me give you an example. I went to the Nepal-India border on one of my many. I spent 6 years looking at organ markets. India has a comparatively good medical system compared to Nepal. So a lot of Nepalis come over for routine surgeries or pregnancies or things like that. And because of this, there's actually a chronic blood shortage on the border. And so the town was called Gorakhpur, has a couple big public hospitals there. And so there was a commercialized market for blood where people would buy blood, and it was sort of quasi-legal to do this. So an entrepreneurial milkman who had also a phlebotomist background went to the bus station and the train station and said to basically the lowest of the skid row, of the Indian skid row, so lowest of the low,
Yeah.
he said to these people, hey, I'll give you roughly 1,000 rupees. So I think at that time was about $25 for a pint of blood. And they said, great, that sounds awesome. And they went to his cowshed and he drained 4 pints of blood from them, keeping them minimally conscious. And then he'd collected about 8 people, I think, maybe it was 12 people at that when the police found him, there were 12 people there. And he was draining 1 pint of blood for them a week, keeping them minimally conscious, like actual cows.
Wow.
This is a thing that actually has happened. There are criminal records on this. And what he would do, since he was doing this for years, when someone was on the verge of dying, he would put them into a bus and they'd like say sayonara, and they'd probably die in the next town over. This is the sort of thing that happens when we let money rule organ markets. And you are in the UK, right?
Yeah.
So you have a much more you have an altruistic blood supply, founded by this guy named Richard Titmuss, who said that you need to have altruistic donations. This is a gift of life that you're giving, and so you don't pay for it, and you should be giving because of your esprit de corps, eventually your nationalism, your belief that we're
Pure
gonna
altruism, yeah.
right, and you've largely been able to meet your blood demands through this. At the same time, when the UK instituted sort of an altruistic system, America had a private system where you could buy directly blood from poor people. And again, what you saw were people in blood shacks next to usually pawn shops who were having their blood drained. And there would be like the newspaper reports were like, there are weevils on the floor. I don't know why you would get weevils. That sounds like a wheat thing. But, like little wiggly worms on the floor. This was highly unsanitary. And again, money ruled the roost. And in the United States right now, I don't think you can sell whole blood, although the laws may be changing around that again. But we see blood plasma things, blood plasma places where, again, homeless people go here and donate the blood, and this is your blood supply. And there are ethical problems with how it plays out. And I think there's also complex ones because, blood plasma is a regenerative tissue versus a kidney. So it's not as bad as giving up a hard tissue, but there's something really untoward about it. And it's akin to some degree about like prostitution, like you're literally selling your body. And how do we ethically want to deal with that? And I think that actually there good arguments can be made on both sides of this, but I think that we're not having those discussions. I think those discussions are hidden behind the idea that, oh, hey, our system's ethical, we're okay, and we just don't look at it. We put the blinders on. And so we don't largely know where the blood comes from. I will say just one more note on this is that the Red Cross is actually the largest, I believe it's the largest nonprofit in the United States, possibly the world. And America is actually a net blood exporter. We export blood and we sell it, and the pints sell for between, and you can sort of see the moving average of what blood sells for, but for between $300 and $800 a pint of blood. So when you're told this is a gift of life that you're giving, and you may save someone with that. What you're not being told is that now that gift of life has gone directly into a commercial market where this money is moving. And, I think that the UK medical system is a lot better than the American medical system. We really love having a very profitable, and all of the problems of a for-profit medical system here. And this is just one more part of them.
I guess if you go one step further than that, it's not only the problem is it's also the healthcare institutions and healthcare professionals who could be corrupt in this system. So far, we've only touched on the point of, it's these kind of middlemen who are, the wrongdoers in this scenario. But actually, as you've outlined, even in the Western world, not just in Asia or Africa, where we like to think all the bad stuff happens, it's actually, everywhere in the world. Even in the UK, the USA, we've got institutions and they look all professional on the cover, but they're involved in this organ trade, this tissue trade, blood plasma trade, but just in a more polished way.
I mean, you are exactly right. That is we put a sheen on it where we think that a person in a lab coat is essentially ethical because you're going to them for help. They better be ethical. And what we neglect to look at directly are the financial incentives behind it. And, it's so hard to talk about this sort of stuff in the current political climate, right? Because we have a lot of people in America, at least, who hate Western medicine and look at this sort of work as a way to say all Western medicine is inherently corrupt and bad, and they're selling our darn babies, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't actually want to push this logic that far because there's so much good about medicine, but there's so much that we don't talk about as well. And what I think that we actually need is to readdress the ethic of medical privacy in the world writ large. So in America, we have something called HIPAA, which is the Medical Privacy Act, which is where you can't release medical records to the public, because by doing that, you would potentially embarrass somebody, or cause them financial hardship if they get fired from their boss. If their boss is like, "Hey, you have cancer, I don't want to deal with that," et cetera, et cetera. That ethic was, I think, set up for a good reason. However, it also has been extended to a point where medical privacy becomes cover for literal crimes. Like it's more of a way so we don't, it disguises things so we don't have to look at them. And case in point is the organ markets, is that you don't know where your human tissue is coming from. You don't know where these kidneys coming from if the hospital doesn't want to disclose it. So how do you know the hospital is not being criminal? Well, you often have oversight boards who do have access to those records, but we've seen time and again that those oversight boards can be corrupted either through direct bribes or just the idea that, hey, we need more tissue, so they just overlook it. They find excuses for why something that happened was ethical when maybe it really wasn't, because there's no public oversight. As an investigative journalist, when I was working on this, and I was working primarily in India, every time I came up against, hey, we have a whole village of people who had their kidneys stolen, we got to talk about this. The hospital was like, well, we can't disclose these records because that's all private. And, cry me a river. I'm so sorry that this happened. And I feel like it's like having an industry regulate itself. Like if you have if Amazon regulates its Amazon workers and says that no occupational agency should look at it, Amazon gets to do whatever they want to their workers. And it's the same thing with these organ markets. So what I suggest is that we have full transparency in certain segments of medicine, where you can trace every blood packet back to its original donor, every kidney back to its original donor, and it needs to be fully public. And I agree that this may reduce the amount of giving that happens in the world, and that there is a cost at that as a society. But we're already paying a different cost right now.
Yeah, I guess that provides some sort of traceability, similar to how if you were creating a supplement and you wanted to be transparent, you would say where you source the ingredients from, which farmer, where, etc. And I guess if I was in a very hypothetical scenario, if I was a billionaire and I was on my deathbed and I was desperate for a new liver or a new kidney, presumably, if I was a billionaire, I may have certain contacts. But how would someone in that sort of scenario who's so desperate to get an organ transplant or some sort of human tissue for themselves to prolong their life, and that is a pretty big driver to do anything, how would they go about this? How easy is it on practical terms to say, I'm dying or someone in my family is dying. They need this organ. They're not going to get it before they pass away. The waiting list is 2 years. I'm going to get it for them no matter the cost. How can someone go about doing that?
Yeah, Karan, I get this question like every time I do an interview about this. And I have an answer for it, and I'm not going to tell it to you. And the reason for this is because I don't want to I don't want to become an organ broker. I can say that it's possible, but I don't want to give you a roadmap, because that is an ethical problem. I will say that criminal markets operate. They're surprisingly easy to access, and you should not do it.
Okay, so it's actually very easy for someone to do that. Which is worrying.
Yeah, Karan, I very easy. No, it's not like there's a phone book like organbroker.com. Although actually now we should go look at organbroker.com to see if it exists, because it might exist now. There are ways to do this. They are not crazy difficult. It does take some work though. I mean, you're not going to, it might take you, if you're a reasonably competent person, a couple weeks to really make a connection. Wow. Yeah.
That's crazy. I mean, okay, so, in the 17th to 19th century, and I think back to the early 19th century, something I was interested in medical school, particularly during my anatomy lessons, were the adventures of William Hare and William Burke, these kind of resurrection men, body snatchers, where I think it was, Edinburgh, of all places, in the early 19th century was the sort of the leading center of excellence for anatomical research. And there's a lot of medical schools in the UK around that time, and there was a huge demand and a short supply of cadavers. And I think the law at the time only made it possible for people who died in prisons, people who died from suicide, and orphans, their bodies to be used for medical research and anatomical research, which obviously limited the supply chain of human bodies that could be used for medical education purposes, which I guess opened up the door for this red market of people to either do the body snatching and rob graves and then sell bodies from the graves to medical schools, but also, as William Hare and William Burke found out, they could actually kill people and then sell those bodies onto professors in medical school. And that became quite a lucrative opportunity for them. Now, this was obviously in the, around the time of the Industrial Revolution, when things were a bit more, even more ethically dubious. But it probably, in some form throughout history, we've had this, red market. Do you think it's ever died down and we saw a resurgence recently? Or is it just, has it always been blooming, just, behind the scenes, and we're just more aware of it now?
Yeah, well, shortly after the Burke and Hare murders, they changed the Anatomy Act to before the Burke and Hare murders, there was no Anatomy Act. So it's like, how do you get bodies? You should go kill them. Then they created the Anatomy Act in order to increase the supply by letting you harvest orphans and criminals, et cetera, et cetera. Because before then there was essentially no regulation. Then they instituted a regulation which was better, but they still had shortages of bodies, and in particular skeletons. And what the British did is, again, India. Why not? We have all these great colonies. Yeah. Let's go get our skeletons from India. So because at that point, Calcutta was the capital of the British Raj in India, they basically robbed every grave and every burning ghat and Christian and Islamic graves as well, and harvested all the bodies, stripped them all of flesh, and exported them. And by 1980, Calcutta exported 60,000 skeletons a year. It became, I don't know when you were trained. You look younger than getting your MD in 1980. But before then, every doctor you studied under bought an Indian skeleton with their books for about $300.
Wow.
And it was a huge trade. It was eventually shut down when a train car full of child skeletons was intercepted in Bihar. Where do you get a train car full of child skeletons? Well, probably murder. That was the assumption. And this led the government to stop the export of human skeletons out of India, and ostensibly also create a plastic skeleton market, which, although plastic skeletons aren't as good as real human bones to study on, they're pretty good. Yeah. You get a pretty good idea of what's going on with plastic skeletons. And so that's how most doctors study on them now. So the question was, has this market morphed over the years? And absolutely, it always morphs. But the point is that there's always demand for human body parts, and they pop up in new and different ways all the time. And we also see that current medical advances in things like, let's just use kidneys because they're so charismatic. We all sort of understand the terms around kidneys. When they first showed up, the first artificial kidneys, I think was in the late 50s, maybe early 60s. And they said that in 10 years, this is when dialysis machines and sort of the first kidney transplants were happening, right? And they said, in 10 years, we're going to have artificial kidneys that you'll be able to install in your body. And the waiting list, incidentally, was 10 years long at that time. In 10 years, we'll have it. So you get on the waiting list. But we're in 2025 now. We're still 10 years away of getting the installable artificial kidney. And that waiting list keeps on growing, even though we've increased the supply of kidneys dramatically in that time. And what actually happens is that demand for human tissue is a function of the supply of that human tissue to come in, because you can always find more people who could benefit from a kidney transplant. You just expand the criteria. And remember that these hospitals make a tremendous amount of money doing organ transplants. And they do that in two ways. One, the actual transplant costs between $100,000 and $1 million to transplant. America has some crazy health laws. You probably know about this. Financing is not transparent, but they might make $1 million on the kidney transplant. And they'll be very specific. You're not buying an organ. You're buying transplant services.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, doublespeak bullshit. You're buying the freaking organ. You don't care about the installation. You want a great organ in that moment. The other way these transplant centers make a lot of money is by advertising the fact that they have transplant services, because we view transplants as like a very high-end medicine. If you can do an organ transplant, you could help you with cancer and these other things. So you see billboards all over America being like, country's best organ transplant area, New York's best transplant center. This is a way to advertise your hospital services broadly to an audience that might be seeking other things as well. So transplants are and organ tissues are monetized many, many ways in the United States. And again, these are things that we need to think about.
I think one thing which isn't quite about tissue transplantation, but it's, I would say, adjacent to what we've discussed, is forced surrogacy. Now, a very popular TV series over the last couple of years has been The Handmaid's Tale, which sees women forced to bear children for rich people in this dystopian version of America. Great series, but
I'm pretty sure that's current America. I don't know. It used to be it's a documentary now.
Yeah. And, the idea of this being done on a mass scale seems a bit far-fetched, but occasionally you see stories of celebrities, having a surrogate in some way. And, obviously we don't have the details of who the woman was who, grew and reared the fetus and the baby. We don't know. What is the extent of this happening around the world in terms of forced surrogacy versus, choosing the right to have a surrogate, paying them to essentially rent their uterus for X number of months?
It's huge. It's a huge industry. So in the early mid 2000s, I'd say probably 2007, 2008, Oprah went to India. Sorry, it wasn't Oprah. It was Lisa Ling, her correspondent, went to India and said, look, we have these houses full of women who are bearing children for Americans who flew abroad to have their, because they didn't want, in America, either they didn't want to bear the cost of pregnancy, the physical cost of pregnancy, or they couldn't do it and they needed to do the whole surrogate route. It cost, I think at the time, I'm thinking that it was around $14,000 or $20,000 to hire someone in India to bear this, and then all of the other services that go along with it. And I actually went to several of these houses in Gujarat where you had just whole groups of women locked in a room, not locked in the room, locked in a house. There was a guard out front under surveillance, gestating. And that was their job. And it was, when Oprah did this, she said, this is all about women's empowerment. That was her talk show about this. This is women helping women. These women are getting paid a certain amount of money. I forget, maybe they made $10,000. I don't remember exactly what the surrogates were getting paid. And infertile women in America are able to take advantage of the service. Isn't this great? Well, what it did was it created many of these houses. Many, many. I went to 2. There were 20 or 30 or 40 in that area, all of women gestating. Now, after my story, this is actually one of the few times that my investigations have actually changed the world. The other time was on my YouTube channel. I did this video about Athletic Greens and I got the CEO of Athletic Greens fired. But in this time, I actually got India to change its laws around surrogacy. It was, to take full credit, it's not true. The Indian press was also very, very important on this. But eventually the word went up to Lok Sabha and India changed its laws. And then the entire industry moved to Cambodia. So now the same exact thing is happening in Cambodia. So this is a big problem. And it's a lot of it is because in the Western world, we have not decided the ethics around surrogacy, what they really should be. And we allow these loopholes to persist. And I guess in the West, we feel that it's okay to exploit people in the third world. Like we have this ethic. We're like, hey, that's cheap labor. And my money gives me the right to do this. And hey, maybe it does. Maybe It does. Maybe that we live in a capitalist world and capitalism is all about exploiting people, and we
Mm.
should be able to do this. And if that's the viewpoint that we want to espouse and present to the world, then that is who we are. But I think that most people I know like to be better people than that. Like to say that I wouldn't willingly exploit another person on the other side of the world, and yet it happens.
Yeah, I guess the truth is that we probably all would love to take that moral high ground, and we would only know the true nature of what we would do once we're put in a certain situation. Say there was someone who got married and they really wanted a child and they couldn't adopt for whatever reason, and they really wanted their own biological child, and that couldn't happen. What would be the driver for them to do such a thing? Or maybe their relative was unwell and they needed an organ. What would they do in that situation? And I think we don't really know human nature until someone is put in that desperation. You could argue in your travels and experiences and investigative journalism about the red market, what would you say is the highlight? That may be the wrong word, but the biggest thing that you've exposed or uncovered?
Oh, well, I mean, I think I was most known for kidneys and skeletons just because those stories had this like shock value associated with them. I think though the most important was the entire thing, to talk about how this whole system operates, because it's interesting that there aren't a lot of experts on organ trafficking in the world. I can probably name 4 or 5 that are out there. I'm one of them, and the people who are actually trying to bring truth to power and show that these problems are real and present. There's a couple people who are activists who are trying to liberalize, by which I mean make selling and buying and selling legal,
Wow.
these markets, who are sort of who go to Congress a lot. But people who are actually trying to shed light on this, we are few and far between. Meanwhile, the players who profit off of it, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people probably involved in organ transplants and tissue processing around the world. How many doctors, your doctor, how many times have you used a blood transfusion?
Yeah,
You,
many.
you are a part of the organ trade. And you probably are saying, I'm saving a life. That's what you're saying. I ordered my blood transfusion because the patient in front of me is going to die if I don't get an organ transfusion.
Yeah.
You're doing an ethical thing. On the other hand, you're relying on a supply chain that you're not sure is ethical. So what are the ethics there? And this is one of my problems with journalism in general. I'm a journalist. I like to stay as a journalist. I would like to continue doing this. But this career that I've chosen is pretty much thankless out there. There's no support for people who are telling the truth. There's a lot of support for people who try to create commercial systems.
You say, obviously, I agree with that. I mean, when someone like yourself is trying to uncover something, certainly there may not be any support. Rather, there could be a lot of backlash, particularly the type of markets you're trying to expose. There are certain people who would stand to lose a lot of money. Did you ever face any serious threats to your life or otherwise across those years when you were exposing and investigating this?
With organ trafficking, weirdly, no. With particularly with the red market, no one ever put a gun in my face. No one ever followed me around and tried to kill. I had one sort of Indian official try to deport me out of India. But I have certainly had attacks on me as a journalist many times throughout my career. I have had guns put in my face. I have had many, many legal threats over the years. I have had people sort of chase me around, and I've had a hitman follow me in India, when I was exposing organized crime in Bangalore. This job is unfortunately very, very dangerous. It is. There's a lot of people who want to do harm, and there's really no support. I have so much unending respect for the investigative journalists out there who do this for basically no money, basically because we want to get the truth out, and more or less we just suffer attacks constantly. I don't know why I'm going on like bagging about how bad my life is here. I actually really do like my job, but I think that the critical research source of journalism is under attack in the world through. First, the government in America right now is making it very, very difficult for journalists to do their job. Free speech protections are under attack. And I think that getting this sort of information out, whether it's about organ trafficking or all the stuff that I'm doing like on YouTube right now, it's getting perilous, and it won't be here for very much longer. It's going to go away.
And beyond exposing the truth, which is obviously a big part of what you do, on a global scale, now that all of these things are surfacing and we're shining a light on these things, what, if anything, is actually being done to tackle the red market? And will we see it, sort of fall again?
We are doing absolutely nothing, Karan. Yeah. The red market has exploded since I put my book out. Since when I put my book, what you asked me earlier, how do I get an organ, right? That was your question. Yeah. And there are lots of ways to do it. When I put the book out initially, it came out, got a lot of press and blah, blah, blah. One of the most common emails I would get would be after there's a natural disaster. I'm thinking particularly the earthquake in Haiti. I got 3 emails from people being like, hey, I have access to a lot of skeletons. How do I sell them? And I was like, I'm not going to answer your question, but like they look to me as, instead of a truth teller trying to get this out there, but as the person to make the connections and sell this. And how can I make money off this? There were organ brokers in Canada approaching me saying, hey, I got access to kidneys. In the Philippines saying, hey, I have kidneys. And this is a thing that is only growing because it's not policed. Like, think about it from the policeman's perspective. You go to a cop pretty much anywhere, and you say, hey, this person stole a kidney from someone in China, and let's say I'm in New York, and they'll be like, oh, okay, well, there's no problem because the crime happened in China. Yeah. So you go, then what am I going to go to the Chinese police, or what am I going to get Interpol to do something, and Interpol's going to write an angry letter at best? No, these things are, once you cross these borders, it gets so complex to do anything about it that no one cares. And the cops usually will just say they're saving lives. I can't tell you how many doctors involved in illegal transplants I've spoken to who have told me that they're saving lives and that they're not, stealing organs. And we have this because they control the information about organ markets, because they control, the privacy doctrines, the privacy ethics and the records releases. They get to say whatever narrative they want about this.
Well, I'm glad that when you wrote your book and you had all these opportunities, you didn't become the leading organ broker in the world. And, you shined a light on a really important topic, which I doubt a lot of people have heard about, but hopefully they have now. So, Scott, I really want to thank you, and just for being so honest and transparent, even though people don't want to hear it. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate you having me on the show. It's great to be here. And like, I'd love the people in this audience to go check out my YouTube channel. It's called Scott Carney Investigates. I do a bunch of investigations. I do less on the red market these days, but I do a lot on like health supplements and grifters, which is a growing problem. Yeah. And it's and just thank you so much for having me on the show. I love your TikToks where you sort of appear out of the side and are looking at some crazy medical stuff and then come off. It's very funny.
Thank you so much.